Welcome back to One Boring Historian. Before we begin, what time is it where you are? Are you winding down for the night, or just starting your morning with a little rebellion in your cup? Drop your location and time in the comments. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel before the kettle cools. Now, picture Boston in December of 1773. The harbor is frozen at the edges. The smell of pine smoke hangs over the city. 3 ships sit heavy in the dark water, their hulls filled not with weapons, but with tea. Above them, church bells echo through the cold, and beneath them, the quiet pulse of something far more dangerous than war, conviction. This isn't the story you learned in school, not a tale of costumes and chaos, but of ordinary people pushed just far enough to stop being polite. It's a story about trust broken, laws ignored, and how a simple cup of tea cracked the foundation of an empire. So settle in, pour yourself something warm, and if you haven't already, like this video, subscribe, and join those who prefer their revolutions slow, deliberate, and boringly accurate. Now, let's begin. The town of Boston, in the province of Massachusetts Bay, in the year 1763, was a place of mud and moonlight, of salt-bleached wood and the slow, patient ticking of a clock whose hour no one could yet hear. It was a small town, a narrow peninsula of some 15,000 souls, where the smell of the sea was a constant presence, a sharp brine that permeated everything, the wool of a merchant's coat, the bread cooling on a windowsill, the pages of a ledger left open in a counting house. From the high vantage of Beacon Hill, one could take it all in, a forest of ship masts, a thicket of spruce and pine, crowding the wharves that reached like slender fingers into the deep, sheltered harbor. The sounds that rose from the waterfront were the sounds of industry and prosperity. The rhythmic creak of hemp ropes against oak timbers, the cry of gulls wheeling over the offal dumped from the fish market, the low murmur of men loading and unloading the holds of ships that had come from, and were bound for, every corner of the British Empire. This was a loyal town, a British town, as English in its heart as Bristol or Plymouth, albeit separated by a vast and temperamental ocean. Its prosperity was the empire's prosperity. Its pride was in its place within that grand, global system. The king's portrait hung in public houses. His health was toasted with Madeira wine in the homes of the wealthy and with hard cider in the dimly lit taverns along the waterfront. To be a Bostonian was to be a subject of the most powerful nation on earth, and for the better part of a century, that had been a source of immense satisfaction and security. Life unfolded to the rhythm of the tides and the turn of the seasons. On a crisp autumn morning, with the frost still silvering the cobbles, the town would stir to life in a series of familiar tableaux. In the warren of streets near the Long Wharf, the air would thicken with the scent of molasses and spun hemp, of coffee and cinnamon, and the pungent smell of hides from the tanneries. Housewives, their baskets on their arms, moved through the market, their conversations a low hum beneath the calls of the vendors selling oysters from the flat sore, apples from the orchards of the countryside. The homes they returned to were, for the most part, simple wooden structures, their clapboard sides weathered to a soft grey. Inside, the light was provided by the flickering glow of tallow dips, or, for the more fortunate, the steadier flame of a whale oil lamp. The heat came from a great central fireplace, round which the life of the family gathered, the women carding wool or stitching, the children practicing their letters on a slate, the man of the house perhaps mending a tool or reading a week-old newspaper from London, its pages filled with debates in Parliament that felt as distant as the moon. In the evenings, the social heart of the town beat strongest in its taverns. Places like the Bunch of Grapes or the Green Dragon were more than mere drinking establishments. They were the crucibles of opinion, where ships' captains shared tales of Caribbean hurricanes, where merchants grumbled over the price of tea or the scarcity of hard currency. And where the first tangible manifestation of this pressure was the Sugar Act of 1764, followed swiftly by the Stamp Act of 1765. They were not, in the eyes of the men in Westminster, draconian measures. The Sugar Act lowered the duty on the lasses, but, for the first time, established a machinery to enforce it with grim efficiency. The Stamp Act required that all legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards carry a revenue stamp, purchased with hard sterling, to Parliament. These were reasonable, modest steps towards making the colonies pay their share. But in the narrow streets of Boston, they landed with the force of a physical blow. It was not merely the financial imposition, though that was keenly felt by men whose wealth was counted in shillings and pence, not pounds and guineas. It was the principle. For generations, the colonies had taxed themselves through their own elected assemblies, the right of an Englishman to be taxed only by his own consent, given through his representatives, was the bedrock of their understanding of liberty. The new laws came from a parliament in which they had no voice, no vote. It was a fundamental alteration of their relationship with the mother country, a silent, seismic shift in the constitution of the empire. The initial reaction was not one of riot, but of profound, almost bewildered, injury. The hum of discontent in the taverns grew sharper, more focused. Men who had once toasted the king now gathered in small, anxious clusters, their voices low. The merchants, feeling the pinch on their ledgers, began to speak of non-importation agreements, a collective holding of the breath to starve British commerce. The pamphlets that emerged from the printing presses of men like Benjamin Eads and John Gill were no longer filled merely with commercial notices or religious sermons, but with essays on rights and liberties, their arguments steeped in the language of the British common law and the Enlightenment. In the counting houses that overlooked the wharves, the ledgers told a new story. The easy flow of goods, the tea, the glass, the paper, the fine cloth began to slow, like a river thickening with ice. The ships still came, but their holds were not as full, and the mood on the docks was no longer one of unalloyed industry, but of watchful waiting. The very air of the town seemed to change, charged with a new and unfamiliar tension. The loyal subject, going about his business, would feel it in the set of a neighbor's jaw, in the more guarded conversations at the market, in the way the king's portrait in the tavern seemed now to look down upon the room not with benign authority, but with a distant, questioning gaze. And yet, for the vast majority of its inhabitants, life in Boston continued, blissfully unaware of the finality of the path that had been chosen for them in London. The storm that was gathering was still beyond the horizon, a bank of cloud too distant to worry the farmer bringing in his harvest or the housewife putting up preserves for the winter, the children who played in the cobbled lanes, their shouts echoing off the overhanging gables, knew nothing of constitutional principles or parliamentary supremacy. Their world was bounded by the scent of their mother's baking, the chill of the autumn air, the warmth of the hearth. A young apprentice, his fingers stained with ink, running an errand for his master, would weave through the crowded streets, his mind on his supper, on the girl he might see at the meeting house on Sunday, on the simple, immediate concerns of youth. He would pass the fine brick mansion of a merchant prince, where the silver gleamed in the candlelight and the conversation over port wine might turn to the troubling letters from London. But the sound of laughter from within would simply be the sound of a prosperous life being lived. He would see the lamplighter on his rounds, moving from post to post as the dusk settled over the harbor, each small flame pushing back the encroaching darkness, creating islands of warm, golden light in a world that was slowly, inexorably, growing colder. In the quiet of the evening, the town would settle into a semblance of its old self. The lights in the windows would twinkle like a scattering of stars against the dark mass of the peninsula. The watch would call the hour, his voice steady and familiar. The only sounds would be the rustle of a cat in an alleyway, the creak of a sign swinging in the wind off the water, the faint, melancholic cry of a foghorn from a ship feeling its way cautiously into the anchorage. It was a scene of profound peace, a community at rest. But it was a fragile peace, a quiet that was too deep, a calm that held its breath. The pressure was building, a weight upon the soul of the town, and though no one could yet see its shape or name its consequence, they felt it in their bones a coming change, a shift in the weather, the charged and electric stillness that comes in the long, silent moment before the breaking of the storm. The change, when it came, did not rive with the clamor of a bell or the crack of a musket, but with the quiet, dry rustle of paper. It was a shift felt first in the counting houses that overlooked Boston's wharves, in the dim, candlelit studies of ministers, and in the taverns where men now gathered not for a moment, but for a new kind of conversation, their voices low and their brows furrowed. The sequence of acts that arrived from Parliament across the span of a few short years, the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Duties of 1767 were, in the ledgers of the British Exchequer, merely a series of pragmatic entries, a means to address the staggering debt left by the 7 Years' War and to pay for the administration of a newly enlarged empire. The sums themselves were not extravagant, a few pence on a pound of sugar, a shilling for a stamp to validate a legal document, a duty on essential goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. To the men in London, it was simple arithmetic. But arithmetic, when applied to the human heart, often fails to account for the deeper calculus of trust and tradition. In the colonies, these taxes were not perceived as simple fiscal measures. They were felt as a betrayal, a fundamental breach of a covenant that had been understood for generations. A covenant that defined what it meant to be an English subject. The principle was an ancient one, woven into the very fabric of their political being. No Englishman could be taxed without his own consent, given through his elected representatives. This was not a radical new idea. It was the bedrock of their inheritance, as settled and unquestioned as the right to trial by jury. And for over a century, this principle had been honored. The colonial assemblies, the House of Burgesses in Virginia, the General Court in Massachusetts levied the taxes that paid for their roads, their militias, their local governance. They controlled the purse, and in controlling the purse, they held the substance of power, the new laws from a distant parliament, in which they had no voice, no advocate. Tore this understanding asunder. It was not the financial burden that galled most, though that was keenly felt by merchants and farmers alike in an economy perpetually short of hard currency. It was the violation of the principle. It was as if the very grammar of their relationship with the mother country had been suddenly and arbitrarily rewritten. A Boston merchant, standing at his desk with a newly arrived ship's manifest in his hand, would now have to calculate not just the price of tea, but the 3 pence per pound duty owed to the crown. In that moment, the transaction was no longer merely commercial. It became constitutional. The purchase of a newspaper, the signing of a land deed, the act of lighting a room with a pane of imported glass, each mundane act was now imbued with a political weight, a silent, forced acquiescence to a power they did not recognize as legitimate. The response began not in the streets, but in the mind. It was forged in the flickering light of candles, burning late into the night in the print shop of Benjamin Eads and John Gill on Queen Street. Here, the air was thick with the sharp, metallic scent of printer's ink and the damp, woody smell of paper. The rhythmic clatter of the press was a constant percussion, like a heartbeat for the growing movement. Young apprentices, their fingers perpetually stained deep indigo black, carefully set the individual metal type, letter by letter, building arguments that would soon be read aloud in taverns and meeting houses across the colony. The pamphlets and broadsides they produced were not mere propaganda. They were careful, legalistic, and deeply felt dissections of principle. John Adams, a young lawyer from Braintree with a fiercely logical mind, wrote essays that parsed the British Constitution with the precision of a surgeon. His words, and those of others, were printed, folded, and stacked, their pages still damp, the ink sometimes smudging at the edges. These papers were then carried by post-riders through the winding New England roads, past stone-walled farms and through sleeping villages, their messages culling slightly in the damp sea air as they were passed from hand to hand. They argued that if Parliament could lay a tax of 1 shilling, it could lay a tax of £100. If it could tax their trade, it could tax their land, their livestock, the very windows of their homes. It was a slippery slope that led not to shared burden, but to absolute dependency. This intellectual resistance found its spiritual and emotional counterpart in the pulpits of New England. The meeting house was the center of community life, not just for worship, but for the discussion of all matters of public concern. On the Sabbath, the people would gather on hard, wooden pews, their breath misting in the chill of the unheated building, their attention fixed on the minister in the high pulpit. Men like the Reverend Samuel Cook of Arlington or the fiery Jonathan Mayhew of Boston S. West Church wove the language of liberty into their sermons, drawing not from Enlightenment philosophers, but from the Old Testament. They spoke of the Israelites enslaved by Pharaoh, of the rights of conscience, of a covenant not just with God, but with each other, to resist tyranny. For a people whose worldview was deeply rooted in a Protestant understanding of morality and covenant, this framing was transformative. The political dispute was no longer just about representation, it was about virtue, conscience, and a divine mandate to resist corruption. The murmurs of agreement that rippled through the congregation were not the sounds of a mob, but the solemn affirmations of a people whose deepest convictions were being stirred. The farmer, his hands calloused from the plough, listening to the minister's words, would have felt a chill that had nothing to do with the frost on the window panes. This was a matter of the soul. And then there were the local protests, the quiet, collective acts of a community drawing a line. When the Stamp Act was to take effect in November of 1765, the appointed distributors in the colonies found themselves facing not bayonets, but a wall of silent, determined opposition. In Boston, the distributor from Massachusetts, Andrew Oliver, was hanged in effigy from a great tree at the intersection of Essex and Orange Streets. A tree that was already being called the Liberty Tree. It was not a call for violence, but a powerful public shaming. A crowd of merchants, artisans, and sailors gathered, not to riot, but to witness. They then proceeded to Oliver's office and tore it down, symbolically, before moving to his home, where they broke some windows. The message was clear. To enforce this act was to make oneself an enemy of the community. Oliver resigned the next day. Similar pressure was applied elsewhere. The stamps themselves, when they arrived, were often stored in fortresses or on British warships, for no public official dared to use them. Courts closed, ships sat idle in harbors. Legal business ground to a halt. This was not anarchy. It was a highly organized, collective withdrawal of consent. The most profound response, however, was the widespread adoption of non-importation agreements. The merchants of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, in a remarkable display of solidarity, pledged to stop importing British goods. It was a self-imposed hardship, a form of economic self-denial that transformed the marketplace into a theatre of principle. The fine silks, the glassware, the imported tea that had been the markers of gentility and connection to the mother country, now became symbols of subjugation. Women, who had no formal political voice, became crucial actors in this movement, forming spinning bees to produce homespun cloth as a substitute for British textiles. The act of wearing a simple, homespun garment became a quiet, personal statement of defiance, a thread of resistance woven directly into the fabric of daily life. In the quiet of their homes, by the light of a single candle, a man might read a broadside at his children sleeping in the next room. The abstract principle of no taxation without representation had, through these slow, deliberate, and deeply felt actions, become as tangible as the woolen shirt on his back. The trust that had once flowed as freely as trade across the Atlantic was now broken, not by a single dramatic act, but by 1,000 small impositions, 1,000 quiet conversations, 1,000 inky words on a page. The colonists were not yet revolutionaries. They were English subjects, trying to call a distant government back to what they believed were its own first principles. They were reminding the mother country of a forgotten promise. Their voices a steady, insistent murmur, growing slowly but surely from a whisper into a chorus, or rising from the simple, unshakable belief that a line had been crossed, and that to step back over it was a matter of honor, a right, and of a trust that could not, once broken, be easily mended. To understand the tempest that was brewing in the autumn of 1773, one must first understand the leaf at its center. Tea was more than a beverage. It was a ritual, a symbol, a tiny, desiccated piece of the global empire that found its way into the humblest of homes and the grandest of mansions. Its journey to a Boston hearth was a long and intricate one, a testament to the vast, humming machinery of British commerce. It began in the misty, terraced hills of China, in provinces like Fujian and Anhui, where the air was thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth. Workers, their hands calloused and stained, moved through the rows of Camellia sinensis bushes, plucking the young, tender leaves a flush of 2 leaves and a bud with a practiced, delicate touch. These leaves were not simply dried. They were withered over gentle heat, rolled to release their internal enzymes, and then oxidized, a process that transformed the green leaf into the black bohea variety most common in the American colonies. The knowledge was ancient, passed down through generations, entirely foreign to the British traders who would eventually consume the final product. Once processed, the leaves were packed tightly into wooden chests, their interiors lined with soft, malleable lead foil, hammered then to create an airtight seal against the relentless damp of a sea voyage. The chests themselves were a work of carpentry, dovetailed and nailed, each one stenciled with the distinctive chops and characters of their Chinese merchants, a script as inscrutable to the average Bostonian as the political machinations that would soon envelop their contents. From the bustling, chaotic port of Canton, a world of lacquer and porcelain, of narrow streets filled with the smell of incense and drying fish, these chests were loaded onto the deep-bellied oaken ships of the British East India Company. These vessels, with names like Lord Sandwich or Royal Sovereign, were floating fortresses of sail and timber, their holds vast, dark caverns smelling of bilgewater, salt pork, and the rich, earthy scent of the tea itself. The captain of such a ship was not merely a sailor, but an agent of a great power, his logbook a record of commerce and empire. The journey was one of almost unimaginable hardship and patience. The ship would catch the monsoon winds, its hull groaning and creaking with a symphony of stresses as it plowed through the vast, empty expanse of the Indian Ocean. Rounding the Cape of Good Hope, where the air turned cold and the waves rose into grey, forbidding mountains. Then began the long beat north through the Atlantic, the crew fighting scurvy and boredom, the chests of tea shifting slightly with each roll of the sea, a constant, subtle reminder of their precious cargo. This was a journey of 6 months or more, a testament to human endurance and the relentless pull of the market. When they finally arrived in the Pool of London, the river thick with the masts of 1,000 other vessels, the chests were unloaded with care onto lighters and taken to the company's massive, soot-stained warehouses. Here, they were stored in towering stacks, the air dense with the mingled rumours of spices, tea and dampwood, awaiting their fate at the public auctions, where factors and wholesalers would bid for the right to distribute them to the American colonies. Only after this grand passage would a particular chest, perhaps a fine bohia or a lighter singlo, find its way into the hold of a smaller, swifter coastal trader, like the Eleanor or the Beaver, for the final leg of its voyage across the North Atlantic to a shop on Boston Erskine Street. The entire process, from a Chinese hillside to a colonial teacup, was the marvel of logistics and distance, the tangible thread connecting a New England kitchen to the most remote corners of the globe. It was a chain that represented order, stability, and the immense, interlocking gears of mercantilist policy. For the colonists, to purchase this tea was to participate in this grand system, to affirm their place within the British world. The very act was a silent nod to the Navigation Acts, the customs officials, the admiralty courts, and the royal authority that made such a complex journey not only possible, but profitable. In that Boston kitchen, the preparation of tea was a small, daily ceremony of civility, a moment where the vastness of empire was distilled into the warmth of a single cup. The lady of the house would often keep the tea caddy, a small, lockable box often made of fine mahogany or even tortoiseshell, in her own care. The key would hang from her belt, a tiny, metallic symbol of domestic authority and the value of the contents within, for tea was expensive, a luxury worth safeguarding. With precise, almost ceremonial movements, she would measure the brittle, cold leaves into the pot, the Chinese porcelain pot itself another artifact of the same trade, its surface a gleaming white landscape of blue willow trees and imaginary bridges. The sound of the leaves hitting the pot was a soft, dry rustle, like falling autumn leaves. Then came the boiling water, poured from a kettle that had been hanging over the fire, the steam rising in a warm, fragrant cloud that carried the grassy, slightly bitter, deeply comforting scent of the leaves throughout the room. This scent, more than any flag or proclamation, was the smell of being British. It was the smell of afternoon visits, of shared news, of quiet reflection. To sit down to tea was to participate in a ritual that defined social order and personal refinement. For the wealthy, it was an opportunity to display their status through their imported porcelain, their silver sugar tongs, and their polished mahogany tea tables. For the mechanic or the shipwright, it was a modest, hard-won luxury, a small taste of gentility, and at the end of a long day of labor, the clink of a spoon against ceramic, the gentle pour from pot to cup, the warmth that spread through the hands on a cold evening. These were the sensations of normalcy, of a life ordered and secure. The empire, for all its distant complexities and brutal realities, was made present in this simple, daily act. The dependence was total. There was no tea grown in the British Empire outside of China, and no other company legally permitted by Parliament to bring it to British shores, this entire global chain. From the Cantonese merchant to the London auctioneer to the Boston housewife, was the exclusive domain of a single, colossal entity, the Honourable East India Company. The East India Company was not merely a trading concern. It was a sovereign power in its own right, with its own army, its own navy, and the authority to make war and peace in the Indian subcontinent. It governed millions of people, collected taxes, and administered justice. It was, in many ways, a state within a state, and its influence in the corridors of Westminster was immense. Its lobbyists and shareholder MPs forming a powerful bloc that could sway national policy. But by 1772, this Leviathan was in profound trouble. A devastating famine in Bengal, which had killed millions, coupled with rampant corruption among its officials and a speculative bubble that had burst, had brought the company to the brink of bankruptcy. Its credit was evaporating, and it was sitting on mountains of unsold tea in its London warehouses, some 17 million pounds of it, a staggering quantity that represented a significant portion of the national debt. Meanwhile, in the American colonies, a thriving trade in smuggled Dutch tea, and taxed and unburdened by the company's monopoly, had captured the market. Tea from Holland was often of better quality and always of a lower price, as it bypassed the British import duty and the company's markup. The company's financial distress was so severe that it threatened to trigger a wider crisis in the British economy, forcing the government to intervene. In response, Parliament, deeply intertwined with the company's interests, passed the Tea Act of 1773. The act was a piece of financial and political engineering, deceptively simple in its design. It did not impose a new tax. The existing townshend duty of 3 pence per pound on tea imported into America remained in place, a stubborn, symbolic foothold of Parliament's asserted right to tax the colonies for revenue instead. The act granted the East India Company a monumental advantage. It could now ship its tea directly to the colonies, bypassing the London merchants and wholesalers and selling it through its own designated consignees in America. These consignees, often men with close ties to the royal governors, were given a privileged monopoly on the sale. Furthermore, the act provided for a full drawback, or refund, of the British import duty the company had paid when the tea was landed in London. By cutting up the middlemen and eliminating the British duty, the company could sell its tea cheaper than ever before, undercutting the price of the smuggled Dutch tea that filled so many colonial cups. It was a masterstroke of economic pressure. To the ministers in London, it seemed an elegant, even generous solution. It would rescue the East India Company from collapse, quietly reaffirm Parliament's right to levy a duty by having the colonists pay it, and give the Americans the cheap tea they ostensibly desired. It was a win-win proposition, a testament to pragmatic governance. They believed the colonists, who had so vocally opposed the townshend duties, would be unable to resist the law of a lower price. They were betting that economic self-interest would finally trump political principle. But in the colonies, and particularly in Boston, a town that had been at the forefront of resistance for a decade, the Tea Act was perceived with a cold and penetrating clarity. It was not seen as a boon, but as a trap, a Trojan horse of the most insidious kind. The lower price was the bait, but the hook was the principle. If the colonists accepted this cheap tea, they would be implicitly acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them, as the pamphleteers and newspaper essays quickly pointed out. To pay the 3 pence townshend duty in Boston Harbor was to surrender the very argument they had been fighting for. Furthermore, the act created a monopoly for the company as chosen consignees men, like Governor Thomas Hutchinson's own sons, cutting out the established colonial merchants and shopkeepers who had previously bought their tea at the London auctions. It was not just a constitutional threat, it was a direct economic one, a move that would concentrate immense commercial power in the hands of a few politically connected individuals, creating a vested interest for the tax itself. The cheap tea was not a gift. It was a test of their resolve, an attempt to purchase their submission for the price of a penny, and to create an American monopoly that would forever alter the balance of commercial power. And so, in the autumn of 1773, as the days grew shorter and a sharp chill came in from the harbour, the familiar sight of tea chests on the wharves took on a new and ominous significance. The first of the company's ships, the Dartmouth, arrived on November 20th, its hull laden with 114 chests of Bohea tea. It was followed by the Eleanor and the Beaver, and later the William. They did not sail in with flags flying, but slipped quietly into their berths at Griffin's Wharf, their presence quiet, looming fat. The chests themselves, sitting in the dark, damp holds of these vessels, were unremarkable objects. They were made of wood, nailed shut, each weighing over 350 pounds. Stenciled on their sides were the marks of their origin and destination, and upon them was the seal of the East India Company, the physical manifestation of the monopoly. The wharves, usually a place of boisterous activity, grew quiet and tense, watched over by a rotating guard of townspeople who patrol the docks not as a mob, but as a silent, determined sentinel. The customs officials, the ship captains, the designated consignees all found themselves in an impossible position. Caught between the unyielding law of Parliament and the immovable will of the people, the 20-day deadline for the payment of duties began to tick down the moment the Dartmouth entered. The harbour, the tea could not be unloaded without paying the duty, and the duty would not be paid. The ship swung at their moorings, their timbers creaking a lonely, rhythmic complaint against the piers, their furled sails snapping in the wind. The tea sat, a silent, potent symbol, and as it sat, the ordinary began to cuddle into the revolutionary. The comforting ritual of the teacup was now shadowed by the silent, waiting chests in the harbour. The fragrant steam that had once signified domestic peace now seemed to carry the faint, metallic scent of lead foil and the bitter taste of political conflict. The world was in that cup. And in the gathering twilight of 1773, Boston was preparing to refuse it. The late autumn of 1773 in Boston was a season of leaden skies and a peculiar, watchful stillness, a hush that seemed to have settled over the peninsula like a layer of fine dust. The vibrant, defiant hues of October, the fiery red of maples, the brilliant gold of elms had faded, leaving the landscape a study in muted tones, the gunmetal grey of the slaty sea, the dull brown of the bare-limbed trees on the common, the weathered grey of the clapboard houses huddled together under a perpetual ceiling of low, scudding cloud. A persistent, damp cold had taken hold, a chill that seeped through the cracks in window frames and bit at exposed fingers and ears. The wind, sweeping in from the northeast, carried the sharp, clean smell of salt and the deeper, earthier scent of wet stone from the sea walls. It was a wind that whipped the harbour into a fretful, iron-coloured chop and set the woodmen in signs along the waterfront to swinging on their iron brackets with a persistent, rhythmic groan, a lonely sound in the otherwise subdued atmosphere. The town itself, usually a cacophony of commerce and community, seemed to be holding its breath. Its normal, boisterous energy muted and turned inward. The conversations in the taverns were quieter, more deliberate. The bustle in the market at Faneuil Hall was less frantic, more purposeful. A sense of anticipation, heavy and undefined, lay upon the place. Everyone, from the wealthy merchant in his brick mansion to the apprentice in his garret room, was waiting, their attention unconsciously fixed not on the town's immediate affairs, but on the seaward approaches, on the blank, grey horizon from which a certain set of sails was expected to appear. The knowledge of the Tea Act and the approaching company ships had settled over Boston like a cold fog, seeping into every lane and alley, a pervasive, unspoken anxiety that was felt in the tightening of a jaw over a ledger, the quick, searching glance between neighbors passing in the street, the way a man might pause at his doorstep in the evening, his figure silhouetted against the warm light from within, to look down towards the wharves, listening to the harbor bells and the wind, as if trying to discern a specific message in their mournful tones. Then, on the morning of Sunday, November 20th, the sighting came. It was the Dartmouth, a three-masted, 240-ton brigantine, her sails pale, almost ghostly, against the grim backdrop of the late November sky. She moved with a slow, almost hesitant grace as a local pilot boat guided her through the narrow, treacherous channel between the outer islands Lovels, Georges, gallops their shores littered with the bleached, skeletal remains of ships that had misjudged the passage. Her arrival was not a spectacle. There was no crowd gathered at the long wharf to cheer or jeer, no official greeting party. The Sabbath stillness saw to that. Instead, the news spread as such news does in a small, tightly knit town alow. Urgent murmur through the congregation outside the Old South Meeting House after the morning service, the words lost in puffs of frosty breath. A quiet word passed between men who stopped to talk with unusual gravity on the street corners, their shoe buckles glinting dully in the weak light, a face appearing at a shop window, the glass already fogged with condensation, to peer out. Towards the harbor, a silent witness to the arrival of the long-dreaded vessel, the ship's master, Captain James Hall, a man accustomed to the routine welcomes of a busy port, would have felt the peculiar weight of the moment as he navigated his vessel to a designated berth at Gree. Finesse Wharf. The usual clamor of the port was unnaturally subdued. The longshoremen and dock workers, who would normally be swarming the dockside, shouting and jostling to secure the best work, stood in quiet clusters, their hands in their pockets, watching. The factors and merchants, who usually came aboard with their brisk inquiries and samples, were conspicuously absent. There was only the forlorn cry of gulls, wheeling and diving in the frozen mist that rose from the water, and the deep, resonant creak of the ship's own timbers as she came to rest, her hull gently nudging the seaweed-slick pilings of the wharf. The Dartmouth carried, among its general cargo of cloth, paper, and other sundries, 114 chests of East India Company tea. They were down in the dock, damp hold, these wooden boxes, each one a compact weight of over 350 pounds, silent and inert, yet their presence was as palpable as a second. Darker hull within the ship, a core of immense political density that altered the very gravity of the waterfront. The following days saw the arrival of two more vessels, the Eleanor and the Beaver, each in its turn taking its place at Griffin's Wharf alongside the Dartmouth, until the three ships formed a silent, brooding fleet within the very heart of the town. Their masts were a bare, intricate forest against the winter sky, a complex web of rigging and halyards that hummed and whistled faintly in the wind, a constant, low-level music of tension. The harbor in winter was a place of stark beauty and physical hardship. In the early mornings, when the tide was slack, a thin, brittle skin of ice would form in the quieter inlets and along the edges of the wharves, cracking with a sound like distant pistol shots as the tide turned and the water began to move. Again, the air was sharp and complex, a layered bouquet of smells, the pure, clean scent of salt, the pungent, smoky aroma of pine tar from the rope walks where men spun hemp into cordage, the rich, earthy smell of oakum being pounded into hulls, and, most pervasively, the smell of wood smoke from 1,000 hearths, the smoke lying low and heavy in the damp, cold air. A comforting scent that now seemed at odds with the unease in the town. The water itself was the color of dark slate, its surface ruffled by the wind. slapping against the ship's hulls and the tarred pilings of the wharves with a sound that was both restless and monotonous. It's a constant, liquid reminder of the passage of time round these three ships is strange. Cold silence seemed to have fallen. Griffin's Wharf, usually a chaotic symphony of loading and unloading, of shouted orders and the rumble of handcarts over uneven planks, was now preternaturally quiet. Its normal business suspended. It was watched day and night by a rotation of ordinary citizen shipwrights, coopers, carpenters, silversmiths who had taken it upon themselves to stand guard. They were not a formal militia, armed and uniformed, but a collection of men in heavy wool coats and worn tricorn hats, their hands thrust deep in their pockets for warmth, their breath pluming in the cold air. They said little, their vigil a wordless, powerful statement that the fate of this tea was no longer a matter of commerce or law alone, but a matter for the whole town, a collective possession whose disposition would be decided by the community, not by the customs officials in their offices or the ship's owners in their counting houses. Within this charged and waiting atmosphere, the mechanics of imperial law and global commerce began to turn with a slow, grinding, and seemingly unstoppable inevitability. The regulations were clear and left little room for interpretation. The moment a ship carrying dusable goods entered the harbor, a 20-day clock began to tick, measured not by the nervous pulse of the town, but by the implacable calendar of the customs house. Within that time, the import duties on its cargo had to be paid to the customs authorities. If the duties were not paid by the end of the 20th day, the law was explicit and severe. The cargo was to be seized by customs officers and, under armed guard from the British troops stationed at Castle William in the harbor, taken to a government warehouse. For the 340 chests of tea now sitting in the holds of the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, this deadline was an immutable fact, a point of collision between the abstract authority of a distant parliament and the tangible, deeply felt will of a local community. The ship owners, Francis Roch of the Dartmouth, and the other investors, along with their captains, were men caught in an impossible vice. They could not unload the tea and send it to the consignees without first paying the tax. And to pay the tax was to invite the immediate and total wrath of the community, likely destroying their businesses and social standing. Conversely, they could not simply leave the harbor with the tea still aboard, as the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, a man determined to enforce the law, would not grant them the necessary clearance pass without the duties being settled. They were, quite literally, stuck, their vessels held hostage by the political stalemate, the scent of the sea and the faint, lingering, almost sweet fragrance of tea that seeped from their holds a constant, maddening reminder of their precarious and profitless position. It is in such moments of suspended animation, when the normal currents of life are frozen, that the subtle, often invisible architecture of popular resistance takes its most solid form. And in Boston, much of that architecture was quietly, painstakingly engineered by a man named Samuel Adams. He was not a fiery orator in the classical, demagogic sense. His voice was often tremulous, his hands, perhaps afflicted with a palsy, sometimes shook. He was a man who had failed in business, a man whose clothes were often shabby and ink-stained, who seemed to carry about him the scent of printer's ink, old paper, and the damp of unheated meeting rooms. But Samuel Adams possessed a different kind of power, one far more potent in the long run, the power of relentless, principled organization and a profound, almost instinctual understanding of political theater and the rhythms of a town meeting. He was a clerk of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, a writer of endless resolutions, petitions, and newspaper essays under numerous pseudonyms, a man who moved not on the center stage, but through the back rooms of taverns and the labyrinthine committees of correspondence that linked the towns of Massachusetts and indeed all the colonies, together in a web of shared information and grievance. He and the group known loosely as the Sons of Liberty were less a secret society and more the nervous system of the resistance, a network of trusted men that could, with remarkable speed and efficiency, mobilize the town's sentiment and direct its collective energy towards a single, defined objective. Their meetings were not dramatic, torch-lit affairs filled with fiery pledges, but quiet, intense gatherings in the back rooms of printing offices like that of Eads and Gill, in private homes whose parlors were dimly lit by a few candles, and in the famed long room above the Green Dragon Tavern, the low ceiling thick with pipe smoke, the light from a flickering fireplace throwing shifting, dancing shadows on the serious, concentrated faces of the men gathered round a table scattered with papers. They spoke in low, earnest tones, planning not for violence or riot, but for a form of mass persuasion, for the careful, deliberate organization of a community's conscience. Adams's particular genius lay in his ability to frame a complex legal and commercial dispute over import duties as a profound moral crisis, a test of the colony's virtue and manhood against the corrupting, innovating influence of a distant, unaccountable power. He understood that the battle would not be won by muskets alone, but by the capture of public opinion, by making the drinking of taxed tea not just unwise, but shameful. And so the town waited. The days shortened, the December light fading early in the afternoon, leaving the narrow, crooked streets in a deep, cold blue twilight, the windows of the houses beginning to glow with the soft, warm, but seemingly fragile light of candles and hearth fires. Inside those homes, behind those windows, the talk, inevitably, was of the tea, of the ships, of the relentless approach of the deadline. A woman knitting by the fire, the steady, domestic click of her needle the counterpoint to the tension, would listen to her husband and his neighbor discuss the latest word from the committee of correspondence, their voices low and serious. A child, sent on an errand to the baker's or the chandler's, would feel the unusual, watchful quiet of the streets and hurry home, the cold air biting at his cheeks, sensing the adult anxiety without fully understanding its cause. The very atmosphere of Boston was thick with a collective, shared tension, a sense of a community that had, almost without realizing it, drawn a line, not in the sand of the waterfront, but in the very fabric of their own lives, their identities, their understanding of their place in the empire. They were waiting to see if the distant, abstract power in London, communicated through the person of the governor and the red-coated soldiers in the fort, would acknowledge their stand, or if it would, through the blind mechanism of law and precedent, force a confrontation for which there could be no peaceful, face-saving conclusion. The ships at Griffin's Wharf, with their silent, contentious cargo, became the focal point of this immense, gathering pressure. They were not just ships, they were a question made of wood and sail, and the whole town, from the wealthiest merchant in his mansion on Beacon Hill to the poorest apprentice dreaming in his garret, was holding its breath, waiting for an answer that only they themselves could give. The creak of their hulls, the slap of the dark water against their sides, were the only sounds in the quiet of the night, a constant, rhythmic reminder that the ordinary, predictable flow of time was about to be broken, and that the deep, anticipatory stillness of the waiting was soon to end. The crisis of the tea, having solidified in the holds of the three ships, now sought a vessel of its own in which to be contained, a forum large enough to hold the collective anxiety of a town. It found this vessel in the Old South Meeting House, a building whose very architecture seemed designed for the purpose of communal discernment. It was not a church in the traditional, sacramental sense, but a meeting house, the Puritan heart of New England's civic and spiritual life, a place where the line between a sermon and a town meeting had always been faint, Its interior was a vast, open space, devoid of ornament, its walls plain whitewashed plaster, its box pews simple and unadorned, focused entirely on the high pulpit from which the word of God and, increasingly, the word of the people was proclaimed. In the days following the arrival of the Dartmouth, this building became the stage upon which the drama of the tea was to be played out, not by a cast of actors, but by the entire population of Boston. The air inside, even on a normal Sabbath, was a particular blend of smells, the faint, waxy scent of decades of candle drippings, the clean, woody aroma of the pine pews and floors, and the close, human smell of woolen clothing and sober industry. But now, in the deepening cold of early December, it took on a new and more intense character. As the people gathered, thousands of them, for a meeting on the morning of November 29th, the very atmosphere of the place transformed. The great doors swung open to admit the pressing throng, let in gusts of frigid air that did little to disperse the overwhelming warmth generated by so many bodies packed tightly together. Men, women, and even children filled every available space, their forms crowding the pews, lining the walls, perched in the deep-set window sills and spilling out into the streets beyond, where they stood in the cold, straining to hear the voices from within. The light inside was a murky, shifting thing. What little daylight filtered through the small, leaded glass windows was weak and grey, quickly overpowered by the flickering, uneven glow of countless candles, their flames dancing and guttering in the draughts that swept the room. This created a scene of restless shadow and sudden, illuminated detail. The earnest, upturned face of a young apprentice, the worried frown of a merchant, the determined set of a woman's jaw, all emerging from and receding into a penumbra of collective presence. The air grew thick, almost soupy, with the heat of respiration, the smell of damp wool drying, and the faint, sharp tang of tallow smoke. And above it all hung a constant, visible exhalation, a cloud of human breath that misted in the chill, a visible sign of the life and the anxiety concentrated within those four walls. The sound was a low, continuous rumble, the murmur of thousands of voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones, a sound like a distant sea, punctuated by the creak of a floorboard as someone shifted their weight. The cough of an old man, the cry of a baby quickly soothed. This was not the silence of a church, but the charged, living quiet of a community in profound and anxious consultation. The business of the meeting was conducted with a solemnity that bordered on the sacred, for the matter at hand was, to them, deeply moral. The forms were those of a traditional New England town meeting, a process of governance they understood intimately. There were moderators and motions, seconds and calls for a vote, but the substance was revolutionary. The first and most pressing order of business was the Dartmouth. The assembled body resolved, with the overwhelming and quiet unanimity, that the tea must be returned to London without the payment of any duty. They instructed the owner, Francis Roch, a young man who must have felt the weight of every eye upon him, to apply to the customs officials for a clearance pass to leave the harbour. This was not a demand, but a collective instruction, the voice of the town expressing its will through the only legitimate channel it recognized. Itself, when Roch returned later that day to report his failure, the collector of customs, Richard Harrison, adamantly refusing to grant a pass without the duties being paid anew, deeper layer of tension settled over the meeting house. The first hopeful avenue of resolution had been blocked. The immutable law of Parliament now stood in direct opposition to the expressed will of the people. The deadline, that 20-day clock, continued its inexorable countdown in the days that followed, as the Eleanor and the Beaver joined the Dartmouth at Griffin's Wharf. The meetings at the Old South became a regular occurrence, a kind of continuous civic vigil the discussions held there were not fiery harangues. Though passionate voices were certainly raised, the tone, more often than not, was one of grave and reasoned resolve. Men like Samuel Adams, with his quavering voice, and John Hancock, with the polished authority of wealth, spoke not to incite a mob, but to persuade a jury of their peers. They framed the issue in the language of inheritance and right, of the ancient British Constitution that was being subverted by a corrupt ministry. They spoke of their children, and their children's children, and the world of abject dependency that would be created if they faltered now. They appealed not to greed or anger, but to a shared sense of virtue, a concept rooted as much in their Puritan heritage as in the Enlightenment philosophy of the day. To pay the tax, even on cheap tea, was to surrender their moral autonomy, to become complicit in their own subjugation. This was the quiet, powerful current that ran beneath the procedural debates, a profound belief that this was a test of their character. The defiance that began to simmer was not the hot, impulsive kind, but a cold, settled, and deeply principled conviction. It was the understanding that some lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed, and that this particular line, the acceptance of a tax levied without their consent for the purpose of revenue, was the one line they could not, in good conscience, cross. The afternoon of December 16th bled slowly into an early, frigid dusk. The great meeting at the Old South had been in session for hours, a continuous, solemn vigil held in the dim, smoky cavern of the meeting house. The air inside was thick with the smell of tallow candles and the breath of thousands, a collective exhalation of anxiety and resolve. The final, slender hope had been pinned on Francis Roch, the young owner of the Dartmouth, who had been dispatched on the lawn. Cold ride to Milton to petition Governor Hutchinson one last time for permission to sail his ship. Back to London, as the weak winter light faded from the high windows, the crowd waited. They waited through the reading of letters and the occasional, somber speech meant to steady their purpose. They waited as the candles guttered and were replaced, their flames casting long, dancing shadows on the intent, upturned faces. The waiting itself was an action, a sustained, collective act of will. Then, near 6 o'clock, Roch returned. His report, delivered to the silent, packed house, was the expected one. The governor had been immovable. The law was the law. The tea could not leave the harbour without the duties being paid. In the heavy quiet that followed this announcement, Samuel Adams rose and declared that this gathering could do nothing more to save the country. It was a prearranged signal, not for chaos, but for execution. What followed was not a riot. It was a meticulously planned operation, carried out with a discipline and order that belied its revolutionary nature. The meeting was dissolved, not with a shout, but with a quiet, purposeful dispersal. Men began to move, not as a surging crowd, but in smaller, directed groups, flowing out of the meeting house and into the deep blue twilight of the Boston streets. The night was piercingly cold, a hard frost already beginning to silver the cobblestones and the wooden shingles of the roofs. A thin, sharp wind blew in from the harbour, carrying with it the icy scent of the sea. The town, which had been the site of such intense, vocal debate for weeks, now fell into a strange, watchful silence, broken only by the purposeful, muffled tread of many feet on the frozen ground, from the lanes and alleys, from the workshops and the taverns. Figures began to emerge. They were transformed. Their faces were darkened with soot from chimneys, and forged hearts. Some had wrapped blankets round their shoulders, others wore old, tattered jackets turned inside out. A number had taken the trouble to fashion rudimentary headdresses, with a few feathers tucked into the bands of their hats. A crude and deliberate evocation of the Native American. a symbol of an identity separate from that of the British subject. This was not merely a disguise to avoid recognition, though that was a part of it. It was a ritual act of shedding their everyday selves, of becoming something else for a few hours, not individuals, but instruments of the community's will. They moved towards Griffin's Wharf not as a disorderly mob, but in a quiet, almost processional column. There was no talking, only the synchronized crunch of their footsteps on the patches of gritty snow and the occasional low command from a leader whose authority was accepted without question. They passed the dark, shuttered windows of shops and homes, behind which other citizens, the old, the women, the children, waited and listened. The only light came from a sliver of a moon and the faint, distant glow from a few curtained windows. The three ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver lay at their butts, their tall masts a delicate black tracery against the star-dusted sky, their hulls dark, hulking shapes against the slightly lighted darkness of the water. The wharf itself was deserted, save for the customary watch of townspeople, who now seamlessly merged with the arriving group. The only sounds were the eternal, mournful creak of the ship's timbers as they shifted on the tide, the gentle slap of water against the pilings, and the sigh of the wind in the rigging. The boarding of the ships was achieved not with force, but with a quiet, determined efficiency. Small parties, led by men who clearly knew their business, ascended the sides on rope ladders or scrambled up the mooring lines. They moved with the practiced ease of men who had spent their lives round ships, which, indeed, many of them had. There was no violence. The night watchmen on board were confronted. Their resistance met not with blows, but with firm, quiet insistence. They were informed that no harm would come to them or the ships, only to the tea. They were escorted below decks or to a secure part of the ship, out of the way. The captains, awakened from their sleep, were given the same assurance. The authority of the crown, represented by these men, was not challenged with anger, but simply, politely, and firmly set aside. The focus of the entire operation was singular and unwavering, the tea. Just the afternoon of December 16th bled slowly into an early, frigid dusk. The great meeting at the Old South had been in session for us, a continuous, solemn vigil held in the dim, smoky cavern of the meeting house. The air inside was thick with the smell of tallow candles and the breath of thousands, a collective exhalation of anxiety and resolve. The final, slender hope had been pinned on Francis Roch, the young owner of the Dartmouth, who had been dispatched on the long, cold ride to Milton to petition Governor Hutchinson one last time for permission to sail his ship back to London. As the weak winter light faded from the high windows, the crowd waited. They waited through the reading of letters and the occasional, somber speech meant to steady their purpose. They waited as the candles guttered and were replaced, their flames casting long, dancing shadows on the intent, upturned faces. The waiting itself was an action, a sustained, collective act of will. Then, near 6 o'clock, Roch returned. His report, delivered to the silent, packed house, was the expected one. The governor had been immovable. The law was the law. The tea could not leave the harbour without the duties being paid. In the heavy quiet that followed this announcement, Samuel Adams rose and declared that this gathering could do nothing more to save the country. It was a prearranged signal, not for chaos, but for execution. What followed was not a riot. It was a meticulously planned operation, carried out with a discipline and order that belied its revolutionary nature. The meeting was dissolved, not with a shout, but with a quiet, purposeful dispersal. Men began to move, not as a surging crowd, but in smaller, directed groups, flowing out of the meeting house and into the deep blue twilight of the Boston streets. The night was piercingly cold, a hard frost already beginning to silver the cobblestones and the wooden shingles of the roofs. A thin, sharp wind blew in from the harbour, carrying with it the icy scent of the sea. The town, which had been the site of such intense, vocal debate for weeks, now fell into a strange, watchful silence, broken only by the purposeful, muffled tread of many feet on the frozen ground, from the lanes and alleys, from the workshops and the taverns. Figures began to emerge. They were transformed. Their faces were darkened with soot from chimneys and forge hearths. Some had wrapped blankets round their shoulders. Others wore old, tattered jackets turned inside out. A number had taken the trouble to fashion rudimentary headdresses, with a few feathers tucked into the bands of their hats, a crude and deliberate evocation of the Native American, a symbol of an identity separate from that of the British subject. This was not merely a disguise to avoid recognition, though that was a part of it. It was a ritual act of shedding their everyday selves, of becoming something else for a few hours, not individuals, but instruments of the community's will. They moved towards Griffin's Wharf not as a disorderly mob, but in a quiet, almost processional column. There was no talking, only the synchronized crunch of their footsteps on the patches of gritty snow and the occasional low command from a leader whose authority was accepted without question. They passed the dark, shuttered windows of shops and homes, behind which are the citizens, the old. The women, the children, waited and listened. The only light came from a sliver of a moon and the faint, distant glow from a few curtained windows. The three ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver lay at their berths, their tall masts a delicate black tracery against the star-dusted sky, their hulls dark, hulking shapes against the slightly lighted darkness of the water. The wharf itself was deserted, save for the customary watch of townspeople, who now seamlessly merged with the arriving group. The only sounds were the eternal, mournful creak of the ship's timbers as they shifted on the tide, the gentle slap of water against the pilings, and the sigh of the wind in the rigging. The boarding of the ships was achieved not with force, but with a quiet, determined efficiency. Small parties, led by men who clearly knew their business, ascended the sides on rope ladders or scrambled up the mooring lines. They moved with the practiced ease of men who had spent their lives round ships which, indeed, many of them had. There was no violence. The night watchmen on board were confronted. Their resistance met not with blows, but with firm, quiet insistence. They were informed that no harm would come to them or the ships, only to the tea. They were escorted below decks or to a secure part of the ship, out of the way. The captains, awakened from their sleep, were given the same assurance. The authority of the crown, represented by these men, was not challenged with anger, but simply, politely, and firmly set aside. The focus of the entire operation was singular and unwavering, the tea chests. Then began the real work. Hatches were carefully pried open. The sound of splintering would sharp and brief in the cold air. Men descended into the holds, where the air was still and thick with the smells of bilge water, damp timber, and the distinct, dry, grassy fragrance of the tea itself. The chests, each one a solid, heavy object weighing over 350 pounds, were hauled out into the dim light on the decks. The work was hard, physical labor. Men strained and grunted with the effort, their breath pluming in white clouds in the frigid air. They worked in teams, their movements coordinated and rhythmic, using their own axes, brought for the purpose, and the ship's own tackle and cranes. They hoisted the chests onto the rails. Then, with a concerted heave, they were tipped over the side. The sound that followed was a distinctive, three-part sequence, the crack of the wooden chest splitting against the rail, the heavier splash as it hit the dark water of the harbor, then a brief, effervescent hiss as the trapped air escaped from the sinking mass of tea leaves, which blossomed into a vast, dark stain upon the surface before slowly dissolving into the depths. This sound crack, splash, hiss became the rhythm of the night, his steady, percussive beat that continued for nearly 3 hours. There was no laughter, no cheering, no vandalism. The mood on the decks was one of intense, focused concentration, a kind of solemn industry. The only words spoken were terse commands and acknowledgments necessary for the work. Men paused to wipe sweat from their soot-blackened brows despite the cold, their muscles aching. They took turns, one team resting while another took over. The operation continuing without pause, they were careful, almost fastidious, in their destruction. When a padlock belonging to one of the captains was accidentally broken, it was replaced the next day. This was not wanton destruction. It was targeted, symbolic annihilation. They were destroying property, a serious crime in any society. But they were doing so with a restraint that elevated the act from mere vandalism to political. Statement: they were not attacking the ships, nor the other cargo, nor the men who served on them. They were attacking the principle that tea represented, the principle of taxation without consent, the principle of a monopolistic company's privilege, the principle of their own powerlessness. Each chest that split and sank was an object lesson, a physical manifestation of their refusal. As the night wore on, the rhythm of the work became almost meditative. The crisp, cold air, the lapping of the water, the rhythmic crack and splash, the sight of the dark, fragrant leaves spreading like a shadow on the water before disappearing, it all took on a ritualistic quality. This was a funeral for the tea and for the old relationship with the mother country that it symbolized. The disguises, the silence, the orderly precision, all served to strip the event of individual personality and imbue it with a communal, almost sacred significance. The men on the ships were no longer a collection of individual artisans, merchants, and apprentices. They were the embodied will of the town, performing unnecessary, unpleasant, but righteous duty. The protest, which had begun in the reasoned arguments of pamphlets and the murmured debates of the meeting house, had now become principle in action. It was no longer an idea. It was a physical fact, 342 chests of it, lying at the bottom of Boston Harbor. By 9 o'clock that night, it was over. The last chest was broken and consigned to the water. The decks were swept clean of any scattered leaves. The ships were left secure, their crews unharmed, their other cargo untouched. The men filed back onto the wharf, their task complete. Then, as quietly as they had come, they dispersed, melting back into the dark lanes of Boston, their disguises discarded, their ordinary selves resumed. The wharf was left to the night sounds once more, the creak of the ships, the lap of the water, the wind. But the harbor was changed. The water, which had for weeks reflected the tense, waiting town, now held its secret. The air, which had carried the scent of salt and wood smoke, now held, for a little while at least, the faint, ghostly aroma of steeped tea, a poignant and defiant fragrance hanging over the dark, silent water, a silent testament to the night that town held its breath and then acted. Dawn on December 17th, 1773, broke over a Boston wrapped in a silence that was both profound and pregnant with unspoken thought. A stillness that felt less like peace and more like the held breath after a sudden, shocking noise. The low winter sun, pale and without warmth, lifted slowly over the misty, grey expanse of the harbor, its weak, slanting light catching the thick, feathery frost that coated the cedar-shingled rooftops, the bare, skeletal branches of the elms on the common, and the brittle brasses of the fortified Copse Hill, the air was still and bitingly cold, carrying the clean, sharp scent of a winter morning, of wood smoke from 1,000 newly stirred hearts, and of the sea that constant. Briny presence, but there was another scent, faint yet unmistakable, that lay beneath the others, a new and peculiar addition to the olfactory landscape of the town damp, earthy, slightly bitter fragrance, the ghost of the East India Company's tea, still clinging to the wharves and the surface of the water, a scent that would linger for days, a constant, aromatic reminder of the night's work. As the light strengthened, washing the narrow streets in a thin, ethereal glow, it revealed the most tangible evidence of the night's events. The harbour, usually a deep, clear grey-green, was stained for acres round Griffin's Wharf, a vast, brownish slick of tea leaves, like a great, sodden bruise upon the water, floated upon the surface, clumping together in the tidal eddies and clinging in damp, dark mats to the seaweed-slick pilings of the wharves. Here and there, a shattered stave from a broken chest bobbed gently in the water, a piece of torn lead foil glinting dully like a dead fish's scale. The three ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver sat quietly at their moorings, looking strangely innocent and vulnerable in the morning light, their decks scrubbed clean, their hulls unmarked, their full sails stiff with rime. They swung gently with the turning tide, their usual creaks and groans the only sounds to break the immense, watchful quiet that had settled over the waterfront. The harbour was preternaturally calm, the water undisturbed by the frantic activity of commerce, as if the town itself were holding its breath, collectively contemplating the scale and finality of what it had done. Throughout the town, as shutters were unlatched and doors cracked open to the cold, the same quiet, internal contemplation was taking place in 1,000 individual hearts. There was no cheering in the streets, no public celebration, no ringing of bells. The mood was not one of triumphant jubilation, but of a sober, almost solemn realization, a collective understanding that a line had been crossed from which there could be no return. Men and women emerged from their homes, wrapping heavy cloaks tightly around themselves, their footsteps echoing with unusual clarity in the crystalline, frosty air, and made their way down to the waterfront, not in a crowd, but in ones and twos, drawn by a silent, compelling need to see the physical proof of the night's events, to make the abstract real. They stood on the wharves, their hands tucked under their arms for warmth, their hat brims pulled low against the glare of the water, and looked out at the floating tea. They saw the great brown stain upon the water, the scattered wooden debris, the quiet, almost forlorn ships. There were few words spoken, or if there were, they were hushed, fragmented phrases, uttered as if in the presence of something both momentous and sacred. It is done, one might say. I would be the only reply. A deep, collective pride was felt, to be sure a fierce, inward pride in the discipline and restraint of their fellows, in the successful, almost surgical execution of a plan that had required immense coordination, nerve, and a shared, unshakable purpose. But it was a pride profoundly tempered by a cold, sinking dread, a visceral understanding of the consequences that must surely follow. Every man and woman in Boston, from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest cordwainer, knew the immense power, the pride, and the touchy honor of the British Empire. They knew that the destruction of property on such a scale, property belonging to the mighty, state-backed East India Company and sanctioned by an explicit act of Parliament, was an act that could not, and would not, be ignored. The question hanging in the frigid air was not if the imperial hammer would fall, but how hard, and when, and upon whose heads. The morning after was thus a time of profound internal division, not merely between Whig and Tory, But within each individual solar division between the fierce, defiant satisfaction of a principle defended and the chilling, pragmatic fear of a reckoning whose dimensions they could only imagine. This internal schism played out in the town as traditional gathering places as the day wore on and the pale sun climbed its low arc in the southern sky. In the taverns, like the bunch of grapes or the green dragon, the air, usually thick with the boisterous sounds of political argument, maritime gossip, and camaraderie, was notably subdued, the atmosphere heavy and meditative. Men sat at the familiar wooden tables, their pots of ale or cider before them, speaking in low, earnest, measured tones. The conversations were not boasts or celebrations, but quiet, intense analyses, post-mortems of a momentous event. They went over the details of the night with the focused attention of craftsmen reviewing a complex piece of work, the efficiency of the teams, the quiet order that had been maintained under pressure, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the act itself. They reassured one another of its absolute necessity, reinforcing their shared conviction. There was no other course, one might say, staring into his tankard, to which his companion would nod grimly, his face etched with the gravity of their situation. The act was justified not as one of wanton destruction or mob fury, but as the only logical, inevitable conclusion to weeks of failed petitions and yielding gubernatorial authority and parliamentary intransigence. It was discussed in the language of last resorts and moral imperatives, a painful but necessary surgery performed on the body politic. In the homes, the discussions were quieter, more personal, and freighted with domestic anxiety. Women, who had for years borne the practical brunt of the non-importation agreements through their spinning bees and their careful household economies, spoke of it over their knitting or while preparing the day's meals at the great kitchen fireplace. There was a shared and spoken understanding that the fragile comforts of their daily lives, the very security of their homes and families, might soon be profoundly disrupted. The act of protest itself had been clean, precise, and remarkably bloodless, but its consequences, they knew, would be messy, unpredictable, and would seep into every corner of their existence, touching everything from the price of flour to the safety of their children playing in the lanes. In the churches that Sabbath, the tone was one of solemn, fearful supplication. The meeting houses were full to overflowing, the congregation sitting in their high-walled pews. The air within as still and cold as the world outside. Their breath misting before them, the ministers, from their high, towering pulpits, did not need to preach explicit politics. The event was the sermon, its text written on the waters of the harbor. Instead, they spoke in the elevated language of covenant, duty, and conscience, of the moral courage required to stand for what is right in the face of overwhelming earthly power. They prayed not for victory, but for guidance, for strength, for the fortitude to endure the trials and persecutions that almost certainly lay ahead. They turned, almost instinctively, to the Old Testament, reading from the stories of Daniel in the lion's den, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, or of the Israelites standing trapped at the shore of the Red Sea, ancient narratives of a faithful people confronting an overwhelming, tyrannical force with nothing but their faith and their resolve. The familiar hymns, like Old Hundredth, were sung with a new, deeper, more resonant feeling, the verses about God's mighty power and deliverance taking on a fresh, urgent meaning. The prayers, offered up by the minister with his eyes closed and hands raised, were met with softly murmured amens that rippled through the congregation like a sigh. In the bowed heads and the intent, worried faces, one could feel a community seeking not absolution, for they believed their cause to be fundamentally just, but the spiritual resilience, the inner fortitude, to face the gathering storm with unity and resolve. Meanwhile, in the panelled offices of the royal government on King Street and in the cramped, rolling quarters of the British warships anchored in the harbour. A different kind of assessment was taking place, one characterized by cold, disbelieving fury for the customs officials, the naval officers, and the governor's staff. The morning revealed not a nuanced moral statement, but a staggering, calculated act of criminality and sedition. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, looking out from the windows of his fine brick mansion, saw not principled resistance, but the complete and utter collapse of civil order, the fruit of what he viewed as years of pandering to mobocratic sentiment. His scribes and secretaries worked with a frantic, grim energy, their quills scratching rapidly across expensive paper, taking detailed depositions from the shaken ship captains and the few loyalist citizens who dared to come forward and speak, compiling meticulous lists of damages. 90,000 pounds of tea destroyed, a financial loss of £9,659, and drafting the first of what would be many urgent, alarmed dispatches to the ministry in London. The atmosphere in these rooms was thick with a sense of violated authority and palpable confusion. How had it come to this? How had an organized mob, for that is unquestionably what they saw, been able to carry out such a brazen, coordinated, and systematic attack on private property, directly under the guns of the Royal Navy and in defiance of the King's sworn officers? The broken tea chests slowly sinking in the harbour were not a symbol of principle. They were a direct, flagrant insult to the Crown, a deliberate challenge to the supreme authority of Parliament, and a thumb in the eye of the world's greatest commercial and military power. The officials took their notes and wrote their reports with a sense of grim finality. They knew, as surely as the townspeople drinking their ale in the taverns did, that the delicate, centuries-old fabric of the relationship between Britain and her American colonies had been torn asunder, not by a formal declaration, but by a quiet, orderly, and devastatingly effective night of work that had left the harbour smelling like a giantess cold. Teapot and the entire British Empire teetering on the brink of a conflict no one could truly foresee. The protest had, indeed, been transformed into a profound moral statement, but it was a statement that to sides would read into entirely different, mutually incomprehensible languages. And for such a fundamental disagreement over principle and property, only one, final, terrible language would ultimately be needed to settle the argument: the language of force. The news of the destruction of the tea took weeks to cross the Atlantic, carried in the sealed dispatches of Governor Hutchinson and the letters of loyalist merchants, their script frantic, indignant scroll against the rolling darkness of the winter sea. When the packets finally arrived in London in late January of 1774, the reaction was not one of thoughtful analysis, but of pure, unadulterated shock that curdled swiftly into a cold, parliamentary fury. The reports were laid before a parliament and a king, George III, who saw the world in terms of order, authority, and the unassailable supremacy of the mother country. To them, the event in Boston was not a political protest with a history and a logic of its own. It was a wanton, criminal act of vandalism, a direct and insolent challenge to the very foundations of their global power. The delicate, fragrant tea leaves, now settling into the silt of Boston harbor, were not a symbol of principle, but of property valuable, sanctioned property blithely destroyed by a lawless mob. The measured, almost ritualistic discipline with which the act had been carried out was entirely lost on the men. In Westminster, they saw only the result: the brazen destruction of £9,659 worth of a major corporation's goods. The debate in Parliament was not a debate at all, but a chorus of outrage. The voice of reason, like that of the elder William Pitt who urged conciliation, was a lonely one, drowned out by the thunderous demands for punishment. The Empire, insulted and defied, would now strike back, not with a random blow, but with a series of legislative acts designed to be so severe, so unyielding, that they would force Boston, and by extension Massachusetts, to its knees, to repent and to pay. The legislative response, which came to be known in Parliament as the coercive acts and in the colonies as the intolerable acts, was a meticulously crafted instrument of punishment. The first and most devastating of these was the Boston Port Act, which received royal assent on March 31st, 1774. Its terms were stark in their simplicity and brutal in their effect. It ordered the closure of the port of Boston, stipulating that henceforth, during the continuance of this act, it shall not be lawful for any person or persons to lade, put, or cause to be laden or put, off or from any quay, wharf, or other place within the harbour, any goods, wares, or merchandise. No ship could enter, no ship could leave. The only exceptions were for military stores and supplies for the king's troops, and for coastal vessels bringing in food and fuel. But even these required special permits and were subject to stringent new regulations. The act was to remain in force until the king was satisfied that order had been restored and, crucially, until payment had been made to the East India Company for the destroyed tea. It was a legislative garrote, designed to strangle the economic life out of the town that had dared to defy Parliament. The other acts followed in swift, grim succession: the Massachusetts Government Act, which effectively revoked the colony's charter, placing power in the hands of the royally appointed governor and curtailing the cherished town meetings; the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in other colonies or in England, a measure colonists saw as a license for a tyranny; and the Quartering Act, which empowered military commanders to requisition empty buildings and private homes to house British soldiers. Together, these acts were not merely laws. They were deliberate dismantling of a way of life, an assertion of power so absolute it left no room for the ancient English liberties the colonists believed were their birthright. The enforcement of the Boston Port Act began on June 1st, 1774. On that day, the British warship Lively, followed soon by the Scarborough and others, moved to take up station at the narrow entrance to the harbour. Their gun ports closed, but their presence an unmistakable statement of naval power. The transformation of the waterfront was immediate and profound. The forest of masts that had always crowded the wharves began to thin as those ships that could hurriedly departed before the deadline. Then silence fell. The Long Wharf, Griffin's Wharf, and all the other bustling piers that had been the pulsating heart of Boston's prosperity became desolate, echoing places. The endless, rhythmic creak of hemp ropes against oak timber ceased. The shouts of stevedores and the rumble of handcarts over the uneven planks were heard no more. The gulls, deprived of the offal and waste of a working port, wheeled and cried in a kind of confused hunger. The great warehouses, which had once smelled of spices, rum, and hemp, now stood with their doors bolted, their interiors dark and filling with a musty, stagnant air. The rope walks were still, the sailmakers' lofts were silent. The very soul of the town, its connection to the wider world of commerce and ideas, seemed to have been surgically removed. The economic impact was catastrophic. Merchants saw their businesses evaporate. Shipwrights and dock workers were thrown into idleness and poverty. The price of everything from firewood to flour began to climb. The scent of the sea was now mixed with the smell of decay and desperation, a constant, humiliating reminder of their punishment. Yet, in this very act of collective punishment, the British government committed a profound miscalculation. They had intended to isolate Boston, to make an example of it, to show the other colonies the price of defiance instead. They unified them the news of the coercive acts did not travel to the other colonies as a warning, but as a tocsin, a call to solidarity. The same post-riders and coastal schooners that had once carried commercial invoices and family news now carried letters and resolves of a different sort. In the candlelit studies of planters in Virginia, in the meeting houses of Connecticut and New Hampshire, in the merchant houses of New York and Philadelphia, the same realization dawned. What Parliament had done to Boston, it could do to any of them. The cause of Boston was no longer a local dispute over tea. It had become the common cause of American liberty. The texture of this burgeoning unity was woven from paper and ink. Letters from committees of correspondence flew between the colonies, their pages filled not with panic, but with a determined, cold outrage. They spoke of the hostile invasion of Boston and the tyrannical designs of a corrupt ministry. They argued that an attack on the charter and liberties of one colony was an attack on the liberties of all. And then they moved from words to action. From the Carolinas, from Connecticut, from the far-flung towns of the frontier, donations began to flow towards beleaguered Boston. It was not merely charity, it was a political statement. A farmer in the Connecticut River Valley, loading a wagon with sacks of his best wheat, was not just feeding the hungry. He was defying Parliament. A planter in Virginia, organizing a shipment of corn and pork, was asserting a shared American identity. The empty docks of Boston became a powerful symbol, but not the one Britain had intended. They became a symbol of shared sacrifice and of a stubborn, collective will that no act of Parliament could extinguish. The military presence in Boston, always a feature of imperial control, now intensified, becoming an occupation in all but name, regiments of red-coated regulars. The 4th and the 5th of Foot were reinforced, their numbers swelling, the sight of their disciplined ranks marching through the quiet, resentful streets, the glint of their bayonets in the sun, the sound of their drums and fifes where once there had been the clamor of commerce. All of this created a constant, low-grade tension that hummed through the town, the soldiers themselves. Many of them young men far from home, were billeted in warehouses and public buildings, their presence a daily insult. The Bostonians, in turn, perfected an art of silent, sullen resistance. They turned their backs when troops marched past. They overcharged them for goods. They met there, gaze with a flat and yielding stare. The town, once so open and bustling, became a place of closed doors and whispered conversations. The punishment had been designed to break their spirit, to force them to abandon their leaders and principles instead. It had forged those principles into a harder, more resilient metal. The shared experience of economic strangulation and military occupation, coupled with the astonishing outpouring of support from their sister colonies, transformed the people of Boston. Their defiance was no longer just about pure taxes. It was about survival, solidarity, and the dawning, terrifying, and exhilarating realization that they were no longer just loyal, if disgruntled, subjects of a distant king. They were becoming something new. A people united not by a common government, but by a common cause, their identity forged in the cold, silent shadow of the closed port and the patient, watchful presence of the king's warships lying at anchor in their harbor. The summer of 1770 settled over a Boston that was, to all outward appearances, a town under a strange and silent siege, a community holding its collective breath while the world watched. The harbor, once the vibrant, noisy, and malodorous heart of its prosperity, had been transformed into a vast liquid quarantine. The great warships of the Royal Navy, the Lively, the Scarborough, the Boyne, stood at their stations like polished, floating fortresses, their rows of closed gun ports a silent threat. their reflection perfectly still in the unnaturally placid and troubled water. The scent of salt and slow decay now dominated the waterfront, the faint, lingering ghost of tea all but washed away by the spring rains and the summer sun, replaced by the smell of tar from the warship's maintenance and the damp, fungal odor of wharf timbers no longer scoured by the bustle of commerce. But if the port was officially closed to the great merchantmen of the Atlantic trade, it was open to a different, more poignant kind of traffic. Small, swift sloops and sturdy coastal schooners from other colonies, their holds filled not with luxuries but with the stark necessities of survival, barrels of flour from the Connecticut River Valley, salted cod from Marblehead, sacks of rice and corn from the Carolinas, firewood from the forests of New Hampshire slipped past the British men of war under special, grudging permit. Their arrival at the beleaguered wharves was a quiet, powerful drama of solidarity enacted weekly. These vessels did not just carry food and fuel. They carried letters from committees of correspondence, printed resolves from other colonial assemblies, and a profound, growing sense of shared grievance that was slowly, inexorably, crystallizing into a shared political identity. The very air in Boston seemed charged with this transformation. It was no longer merely the air of a punished English town. It was becoming the air of a cause, a nascent idea whose name was not yet fully spoken, but whose presence was felt in the determined set of a merchant Esjor, as he accepted a donation of grain from a Connecticut farmer, in the resolute calm of a woman managing a household under the shadow of scarcity, in the way that town's ministers, in their Sabbath sermons, began to speak less of a specific grievance and more of a people being tested. A people chosen for a trial of virtue that would define their character. For generations, this spirit of collective resolve, born from the specific, targeted punishment of Boston, demanded a collective, continental voice, the call, echoing from the dissolved Virginia House of Burgesses, for a Congress of all the American colonies to meet and deliberate on their common future, was answered not as a suggestion, but as a necessity. And so, in the early autumn of 1774, as the first hints of brilliant color touched the sugar maples of New England and the air took on its first crisp edge, a solemn procession of carriages and solitary riders made its dusty way south and west to Philadelphia, the men who carefully disembarked in that bustling, brick-paved city men like the intense, logical John Adams and his shrewd, organizing cousin Samuel from Massachusetts, the tall, quietly imposing George Washington and the fiery orator Patrick Henry from Virginia, the cautious, legalistic John Jay from New York were not yet revolutionaries in their own minds or in their stated intentions. They saw themselves as petitioners, as representatives of injured but loyal subjects of the crown, men who believed a great and terrible constitutional mistake was being made, a mistake that could be corrected if only reason, precedent, and their undoubted rights as Englishmen were properly and forcefully presented. They gathered not in a grand state house, but at Carpenter's Hall, a modest two-story building of Ulm, red brick belonging to the Guild of Carpenters, a setting far removed from the gilded pomp of a royal court and deeply symbolic of the practical, artisanal spirit that was beginning to define the resistance. The room they entered was simple and functional, its air smelling faintly of fresh sawdust and beeswax, its light filtering through clear-paned windows to fall upon plain, sturdy wooden tables and the unadorned paneling of the walls. Here, in this unpretentious space, the first tentative architecture of an American Union began to take shape, not with a dramatic declaration, but with slow, careful, and deeply earnest deliberation. The debates within the hall were long, painstaking, and often fraught with tension. The delegates from the different colonies, from the rocky coasts of New Hampshire to the swampy rice plantations of Georgia, were not natural allies. A merchant from Boston, whose wealth was tied to the carrying trade of the Atlantic, and a tobacco planter from the northern neck of Virginia, whose prosperity depended on the soil and the credit of British factors, lived in vastly different worlds, with conflicting economic interests, social structures, and deep-seated provincial suspicions. This mistrust was a tangible presence in the room, as real as the sheaves of paper, the inkwells, and the quills that lay upon the tables. Yet the shared narrative of Boston, of the destroyed tea and the subsequent Port closure and the revocation of Massachusetts' charter, acted as a powerful, unifying crucible. When the Massachusetts delegates rose to speak, their voices measured but firm, they were not describing a local misfortune, but a chilling precedent, a blueprint for the potential subjugation of every colony. The words that were spoken, debated, and meticulously written down in the resolves and petitions of this first Continental Congress, words like rights, liberty, property, and representation, began to undergo a subtle but profound alchemy. They were no longer just political slogans or abstract principles debated in the pages of pamphlets. They were becoming the foundational elements of a shared political destiny, the lexicon of a new collective identity. To speak of the rights of Englishmen was one thing, but to collectively define, assert, and vow to defend those rights in the face of the world. Its greatest military and naval power was to begin the unconscious process of forging a new political entity, the Continental Association, a renewed and unified agreement of non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption, was its first concrete, breathtaking manifestation. It was a pledge of mutual economic resistance, a promise that the colonies would stand or fall together, that the empty docks of Boston were a symbol of a shared sacrifice, and that the fate of one was now irrevocably the fate of all. Back in the towns, villages, and farmsteads that stretched from the rocky coast of Maine to the fertile valleys of the Carolinas, this seismic shift in political consciousness was reflected not in grand oratory, but in 1,000 small, deliberate, daily acts. The words debated by the journalmen in Philadelphia were printed in broadsides and newspapers, carried by post riders along the muddy post roads, and read aloud from the steps of rustic courthouses and in the smoky, dim light of countless taverns. Their meaning was digested, discussed, and internalized by farmers with dirt under their fingernails, by blacksmiths with soot on their faces, by housewives managing complex household economies. The simple, domestic act of drinking coffee instead of tea, once a matter of personal preference or economy, was now a public, political declaration of unity, a small but potent ritual of defiance. The wearing of homespun cloth, a rough, humble, and often itchy fabric, became a powerful badge of honor, a visible, tactile rejection of British broadcloth and the entire mercantile system it represented. In countless newly formed local committees of safety and inspection, ordinary menumen farmers, shopkeepers, shipwrights found themselves invested with a new kind of authority, not derived from the commission of the Crown or the appointment of a royal governor, but from the direct consent and trust of their neighbors. They were the ones tasked with enforcing the Continental Association, with inspecting cargoes, with judging their peers for violations, and with managing local affairs in open, practical defiance of the established imperial government. This was a quiet, grassroots revolution in the very concept of authority, a hands-on education in self-governance that was, in its mundane, day-to-day reality, more significant than the loftiest philosophical debates happening in Philadelphia. A man who had served on such a committee, who had stood with his neighbors and helped make and enforce a collective decision for the common good, would never again see himself as merely a passive subject whose only role was to obey. He had tasted a different kind of citizenship, one that was active, responsible and rooted in local community. The emotional landscape of this period, for the vast majority, was not one of fiery, uncomplicated patriotism, but of deep, wrenching, and profoundly unsettling ambivalence. The pull of old loyalties and affections was immensely powerful, a deep, sentimental current running through their lives. The king was not a distant abstraction or a tyrant. He was the font of law, the symbol of order and legitimacy, the apex of a world they and their ancestors had been born into, fought for, and died for over generations. To defy him was to defy the very frame of their existence, to tear at the fabric of their own identity. For every fiery radical like Samuel Adams, who had long seen independence as the only logical end, there were a dozen thoughtful, anxious, and deeply conflicted men and women who lay awake at night, tormented by the gravity of the path they were being forced to walk. They were taught from childhood to revere the British Constitution, to see it as the ultimate guarantor of their freedoms. Now, they were being driven to the terrible, heart-rending conclusion that this same Constitution, as interpreted by a distant and unheeding Parliament, had become the very instrument of their potential enslavement. This profound internal conflict between the deep, almost visceral love for the mother country and the cold, rational, and increasingly undeniable conviction that their most essential rights were being systematically dismantled was the true, painful crucible in which an American identity was forged. It was a slow, painful sunrise, not a sudden explosion of light. A dawning realization that crept upon them through a succession of crises, each one stripping away another layer of old affection. The connection from the shattered tea chests of a cold December night to the resolute, unified voice of the Continental Congress was not a straight, clear line, but a meandering, often dark path through a wilderness of doubt, fear, and earnest. Soul-searching deliberation, the spark cast onto the dark water of Boston Harbor had not immediately started a blazing fire. It had smoldered, banked in the ashes of resentment, fed by the harsh and forgiving winds of the coercive acts, and fanned by the steady, strengthening breath of shared outrage from Georgia to New Hampshire, until, in the quiet, serious, and purposeful atmosphere of Carpenter's Hall, it finally found its collective voice. It was a voice that still pleaded for reconciliation, that still proclaimed its loyalty to the crown, but it was also a voice that spoke with a new, formidable and continental strength, a voice that had begun to understand, in its deepest recesses, that its words, if unheard and unheeded, would inevitably, tragically, have to be followed by something harder, more final, and written not in ink, but in blood. The spark was now a steady, gathering flame, and it was illuminating a path that led away from the familiar, comforting shores of the old empire, toward a vast, uncharted, and uncertain new world. The passage of years has a way of smoothing the sharp, jagged edges of history, of softening the clamor of past events into a distant, almost melodic hum, a story told and retold until it's raw. Disruptive power is journaled into narrative. The fervent passions of 1773, the cold, gnawing dread of the following winter, the grim, day-by-day resolve of the military occupation, these visceral realities have all receded, leaving behind not just the dry, precise facts recorded in merchant ledgers and official parliamentary dispatches, but something quieter, more reflective, a resonance that lingers in the air long after the sound has faded. To consider the Boston Tea Party now, from the calm vantage of distance, is to observe a single, deliberate, and strikingly localized action, a precise incision into the fabric of the status quo, and to trace the concentric, ever-widening circles it sent rippling out across the vast, placid surface of a global empire. Circles that would eventually widen to touch shores and shape destinies its participants could. never have conceived in their most ambitious dreams. It began not on a sweeping, smoke-wreathed battlefield, but in the cramped, dark hold of a merchant ship, not with a philosophical declaration, but with the methodical, physical crack of splintering wood and the brief, effervescent hiss of our escaping a sinking chest. It was an argument made not with lofty words, but with calloused hands and aching muscles, a statement written in 340 to chests of valuable tea upon the dock, cold, indifferent water of a colonial harbor, and in the profound, watchful quiet that followed this act of destruction. The very foundations of the world's most powerful and self-assured empire began, almost imperceptibly at first, to tremble and shift, the first subtle tremors of a seismic break that would, in time, redefine the modern world. We must, in our reflection, remember the true, almost humble scale of the event on the global stage of the 18th century, amidst the grand dramas of European wars and the administration of territories in India and the Caribbean. The destruction of the tea was, in cold financial terms, a minor act of coordinated vandalism, a footnote in the vast, leather-bound ledgers of the East India Company, a fleeting, irritating dispatch for a parliament grappling with the governance of continents and the management of a national debt. The participants themselves were not the marble-hewn, legendary heroes of later mythology, but men with practical trades and domestic concerns, coopers, shipwrights, blacksmiths, physicians, their faces deliberately smudged with soot and lamb-black, their muscles aching from the hard, physical labor of lifting and breaking and heaving. They acted from a deeply felt, yet profoundly local and immediate, sense of constitutional injury. They believed they were defending a principle they considered as fundamentally English as the common law itself, the ancient, hard-won right of an Englishman to be taxed only by his own elected representatives. Their defiance, in those initial moments, was not aimed at the sacred person of the king, nor at the venerable institution of monarchy itself, but at a specific, perceived overreach of parliamentary power, a corruption of the system as they understood it. They sought, in their minds, to correct a fault, to return to a previous, idealized balance, not to shatter the entire imperial framework. And yet, in the elegant and yielding and ultimately arrogant logic of the imperial response, in the coercive acts so meticulously designed to punish, humiliate, and isolate, they found their local principle magnified, amplified, and broadcast across the 13 colonies the punishment intended to break the spirit of a single, stubborn town instead forged the soul of a union, transforming a protest over the price and principle of a beverage into a fundamental, continental debate about the very nature of sovereignty, the legitimate use of power, and the inherent rights of subjects living an ocean away from the seat of that power. This is the peculiar, unpredictable alchemy of history, where small, defined acts, born of immediate and tangible grievance, can gather a weight and a momentum far beyond their original, limited intent, acquiring the symbolic power that transcends their physical reality. The world, it seems, is reshaped not only by the grand, sweeping movements of armies and the thunderous edicts of great men and women, but just as often by the accumulated, critical mass of countless small, stubborn stands, by the quiet, often solitary refusal of ordinary people to yield a point of principle they hold more dear than their own comfort or safety. We can observe this pattern echoing elsewhere, in other times and other places, in those crystalline moments when the sheer, unadulterated force of a deeply held conviction outweighs the natural, primal human instinct of fear and self-preservation. One might think, for instance, of the solitary figure placing their own body before a line of advancing tanks, an act of breathtaking insignificance against the colossal, grinding machinery of the state, yet an image so potent, so morally clear, that it etches itself permanently onto the conscience of the world, becoming a symbol of individual courage against impersonal power. Or consider the quiet, weary determination of a woman who simply refuses, one ordinary evening, to surrender her seat on a public bus, is small, personal fatigue measured against the vast, entrenched architecture of legal segregation, yet a simple gesture of tired defiance that becomes a pivot, a catalyst, upon which the moral arc of a nation's history decisively turns. These are not, in and of themselves, moments of triumphant, final victory. They are moments of pure, unadulterated conviction, flashes of raw moral courage. They are the spark, struck in the darkness, the conflagration that may follow the movement, the revolution. The great historical shift depends entirely on the tinder it finds, on the dry, prepared kindling of wider, simmering grievances and the prevailing winds of social and political circumstance. The men who boarded the ships in Boston that cold December night did not, themselves, light a fire that would consume an empire. They merely struck a flint. It was the empire's own response, the closure of the port, the revocation of the charter, the visible presence of red-coated soldiers in the streets that provided the abundant, dry tinder, heaping frustration upon resentment until the initial, bright spark of principle ignited the flames of a widespread, organized resistance that could no longer be contained by reason or force. To stand now, in the mind's eye on the edge of that same harbor, is to feel the immense, almost incomprehensible distance traveled since that specific December night. The water today is still and cold, a vast, shimmering sheet of pewter gray beneath a wide winter sky, precisely the same color it was then. The gulls still wheel and cry their same, lonely, timeless cries. The air, sweeping in from the Atlantic, still carries the bracing, clean scent of salt and, if one imagines hard enough, concentrates one's historical senses, perhaps the faintest, most spectral hint of wet, decaying tea leaves, a phantom rumor, a memory carried on the tide of time. But the world this harbor now reflects is utterly, fundamentally changed. The wharves, once silent, empty, and patrolled under the watchful guns of the Royal Navy, now bustle with a commerce that spans a continent, not a single loyalist empire. The lights that twinkle from the dense, modern city behind are no longer the flickering, uncertain glow of candle and hearth-fire from the homes of loyal British subjects, but the steady, electric illumination of a sovereign republic that grew, in no small part, from the radical seed of the principle defended here with axes and resolve. There is no grand, triumphal monument standing in the water, no colossal bronze statue marking the exact spot where the tea was consigned to the deep. The event, in a way more profound than any physical marker, is commemorated in the quiet, everyday functioning of a system of government that derives its just power from the consent of the governed. In the very idea, now so commonplace as to be often taken for granted, that a people can constitute their own political destiny, that they are the ultimate source of legitimate authority. This is not a story that ends, or should end, with a simple, triumphant conclusion, the path from the disciplined protest of the Tea Party to the bloody, uncertain struggle for independence was not straight, nor was it inevitable. It was a road paved with anguish, bloodshed, bitter betrayal, and immense, often unrecorded, human suffering. The war that followed would tear families and communities apart, pit neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, and demand a price in human life, happiness, and social cohesion that none of those men, their faces smeared with soot in the December darkness, could have fully comprehended or would have lightly chosen. The principle they defended was noble, its articulation clear and compelling. But the human cost of finally securing it was staggering, a debt paid in the currency of pain and loss for a generation. To reflect on this with any degree of honesty is to understand that history is rarely a simple, clean morality tale of good versus evil. It is, rather, a complex, often messy tapestry of cause and effect, of noble intentions colliding with harsh realities, of courage existing alongside profound, tragic loss. The Tea Party itself was a moment of remarkable unity and conscious discipline, a moment when a diverse community acted, for a few hours, as a single body with a single will. But that hard-won unity would be tested to its breaking point in the years to come, and the discipline learned in the orderly destruction of property would soon be turned to the grim, brutal business of war against the world's most professional army. And so, we leave the story here, not at a ringing declaration or a victorious, smoke-cleared battlefield, but at the water's edge, in the quiet, sober space of reflection. The harbour is still, the tea long since dissolved, its physical substance consumed by the sea, its story absorbed into the deep, silent silt of the ocean floor, becoming itself a part of the geology of history. The empire that was so boldly challenged has itself evolved, its shape and character irrevocably changed by the very forces of liberty and self-determination. It could not ultimately contain the act of defiance, so specific in its target, so limited in its initial scope, continues to resonate down the centuries as a powerful symbol, a symbol of the potent force of collective principle, of the law of unintended consequences that governs the actions of states, and of the quiet, undeniable truth that the deepest currents of history, which reshape continents and redefine human possibilities, are often set in motion not in the palaces of kings or the tents of generals, but by the determined, purposeful actions of ordinary people, standing in the cold, doing what they believe, in the profound stillness of their own conscience. Simply must be done. The tide continues its eternal, patient work of flowing in and out, as it always has and always will, washing over the place where the tea once floated like a temporary, inky stain upon the water, a fleeting mark that, against all odds, ultimately helped to write a new and enduring chapter in the long and finished story of human governance and freedom. And that was the Boston Tea Party, not a night of chaos, but a moment of clarity, when patience ran out and conviction took its place. No swords drawn, no blood spilled, just the sound of wooden crates breaking the surface of a cold harbor, and a quiet decision that would change everything. What followed wasn't freedom, not yet. It was hardship, punishment, and years of uncertainty. But somewhere between the frozen docks and the rising tide, an empire learned what happens when ordinary people refuse to be unheard. If you made it this far, tell me, what time is it where you are? Are you listening in the dark, or somewhere the sun's just coming up? And what would you have done that night? Stayed home, or walked down to the harbor? If you enjoy quiet journeys through the turning points of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and come back for the next story. Until then, stay curious, stay calm, and as always, boringly accurate.